right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I'm going to get straight to it. So there's been a lot of you guys as viewers that have been asking me to diversify my content and include stories about the Nuestra Familia. Some of you have been very vocal about it. And to be quite honest, I've probably even lost some viewers because I've been putting out content almost exclusively about the Mexican Mafia. But for those of you that just started watching my channel, and for argument's sake, let me just say this. For the first 2 or 3 years after I created this channel, I was putting out content almost exclusively about the Nuestra Familia. Nothing else. I was doing a lot of Q&As, my inner demons, war stories, but most of the content that I was putting out at that time was almost based exclusively on the NF. But that's all I talked about. I ran story after story. I did profiles. I talked about some of my own personal experiences. All you guys got to do is scroll back on my channel and go through my video portfolio, and you guys will find those videos yourselves. To be completely honest with you guys, the only reason why I switched it up is because you guys asked me to bring you content on the Mexican Mafia. And after I seen the level of interest that was out there, that's why I continued to run those stories. Rest assured, I do read the comments, even though I might not answer all of them. I read them to keep myself up to speed with what you guys are saying because that's important to me. Anyways, I said all that to say this. From this point on, I will start diversifying my content and I will start bringing you guys stories on the Nuestra Familia as well as the Mexican Mafia. I'm going to mix it up and give you guys a little bit of both. I told you guys I was bringing back inner demons and war stories, and I'm going to honor that as well. Q&As and lives with the raffles or something else that I plan to bring back in due time. But at least for now, let me get away from being one-dimensional and start phasing these things in slowly. You know, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Paradigm Media News is your channel. You guys are the ones that built it up. Without you, it would be nothing. I'm just the guy in the background creating the type of content that you guys want to see. So when it's within reason, I'm always going to honor the voice of the channel. So anyways, some of you are probably already aware of this, but early last month, after 4 years, Mateo Rocha, Mateo from Salinas, was finally sentenced in federal court. But before I get into the specifics about his sentencing and what this means for him, let me just talk a little bit about my personal interaction with Mateo and the decades-long history that we have with each other. So for those of you that don't know this, my history with Mateo dates as far back as the late 80s, early 90s, somewhere close to 35 years. And although we were both members of the Nuestra Familia and functioned together in that capacity, Mateo's always been like family to me. So our bond went beyond prison politics. And real quick, this is to those of you that also made a commitment to one of these criminal organizations, whether it was the NF, the ME, the NR, the AB, NLR, P9, BGF, Skinhead, etc., etc. Regardless of what it was or how far you made it. You know, when you were out there in the field, in the trenches, and you were functioning with certain individuals, I know that there's some of you guys that also forged bonds with someone and connected on another level, and that you guys had each other's backs no matter what. You know, without delving too deep into the protocols or the political side of this, let me just put it to you guys like this. When you make a commitment to one of these criminal organizations, this commitment is supposed to take precedent over everything else in your life. All the things that you were once loyal to before you made this commitment, the things that were important to you, in theory, now become secondary. And this includes the things that are considered to be tangible possessions, as well as the things that are intangible. Things like your freedom, monetary possessions, your own political beliefs, etc., etc. You know, some of you guys might remember some of the verbal commitments that were recited to me by my Kio from Salinas when I went through my induction ceremony. And this is a good example because when I was recruited into the NF back in 1994 and my loyalties were being explained, I was asked things like, would I be willing to kill my own flesh and blood if I was ever put in a situation like that? Or I was told that if I had a child that was on his deathbed and I was there with them at the hospital and the brothers called for me, that I would be expected to abandon that child and honor my commitment to the oath. In retrospect, I now realize how callous and how stupid that might sound, but that's not the point that I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is this. When you take an oath and you make a commitment to one of these organizations, nothing is supposed to supersede that commitment or rise above the unfettered loyalty that's expected of you. Nothing, your kids, your family, your beliefs, or your personal possessions. But for those of you who understand and who are keeping it real, I'm sure you guys can relate to what it is I'm trying to say. And that's that despite the fact that you're not supposed to place your loyalty in other members or forge these kind of bonds, it happens all the time. And it's to be expected. You're out there in the field taking these kind of chances, putting your life in somebody else's hands. The trust and loyalty that you build with someone like that is going to be on another level. I'm just talking about being in the struggle with someone, doing things out in the field with another brother that leads to you placing a deeper level of trust and confidence in this guy. Someone you know who isn't going to throw you under the bus, or someone who you know is going to have your back no matter what happens. Because I'll tell you guys like this, just because someone makes a commitment to one of these organizations doesn't mean that you can automatically trust this individual with your life, nor does it mean that he's always going to have your back if and when you get into some sticky situations. I met a lot of NF members that I flat out didn't like, didn't trust, and I wouldn't place any confidence in them. But Mateo was one of those brothers that I took a liking to, and we clicked as soon as we met. And over the years, I got to know his whole family. His mom, Maria, his dad, Silver Fox, and his three sisters, Lisa, Nena, and Sophie. You know, some of you heard me talk about this before as well, but there was quite a few homeboys from Salinas that I took a liking to, and I had similar bonds with them the same way I did with Mateo. And just for the record, I'm referring to individuals like Larry Amaro, Baki, Robert Hanrahan, Bubba, Juan Gallegos, Wino, Roque Martinez, Boxer, Robert Rose, Chico, and Gabe Caracheo, G Money. These were all my boys, and they were all NF members with the exception of G Money. And by now, that's probably even changed because they all got wrapped up in Operation Valley Star, and G Money got sentenced to 25 to life in the feds with the rest of them. Boxer was the only one that didn't get caught up in Operation Valley Star. He got indicted in that Cap Saloon incident where Mondo Frias, who also went by Tizo, was caught on camera shooting Raymond Sanchez. You know, I'm not going to go through Mateo's entire history. Maybe later I'll circle back and do a profile on him. But over the years, Mateo became a leader, and he had a lot of influence in Salinas. He was someone that was glorified and looked up to by most of the Norteños out there. And it wasn't based on his status as an NF member either. That would come later. It was because of how he carried himself and because of the work that he was putting in out on the streets. Mateo was a Samster. He was from one of the biggest Norteño street gangs in Salinas, Salinas East Marqueta, and he made a name for himself out there. But after Mateo went to prison, he continued to build off of that reputation and became known by Norteños all across Northern California. Now, I remember running into Mateo in R&R in San Quentin sometime around 1993 or 1994. I was paroling after doing a short violation, and he was on his way back to the Monterey County Jail to fight a cold case murking that he would eventually get convicted on. And this is the case that he would remain in custody on until this day, almost 34 years later. Now, I'm sure most of you guys remember how him and Baby Joker from Watsonville got caught up in the NF power struggle between the state and federal factions. But at one point, Mateo and BJ became two strong voices and, in essence, a guiding light for a lot of other NF members and our members, and even some of the more influential Norteños. Basically, all those who had pledged to continue following NF leadership that had been commuted to the federal BOP. No, there was a lot going on at that time. The Truth Filter had just been leaked and disseminated across several channels on YouTube. And this would eventually escalate and lead to both Mateo and BJ both being hit by the self-appointed leadership in the state system. The ones that, again, basically hijacked those positions and initiated the power struggle. Individuals like James Perez, Conejo from Sacra, Antonio Guillen, Chuco from San Jose, David Cervantes, DC from Chino, George Franco, Puppet from San Jose, and some of their minions. BJ had acquired a lot of influence and respect in his own right, but Mateo was so respected and revered that a squad of NF members and NR members banded together and rose up to defend him when the state faction sent a squad of hitters to take him out. You know, I can't show you guys the pictures, but I've actually got pictures of Mateo after he was hit that shows him on the ground, bleeding and handcuffed a few minutes after he was hit. I even have a picture of BJ after he was hit, laying in the hospital with tubes everywhere. YouTube would definitely strike me because of the blood and the graphic nature of those pictures, but the one picture that I can show you is a picture of Mateo after they cleaned him up and after he came out of the prison's infirmary. This was right after the incident when he was on his way to ADSE. Federal NF leadership depended on them to become conscripts and to basically defend their honor by getting the entire state system back under federal authority. This in itself was an arduous undertaking, and without sounding too critical, I just think they were kind of thrown under the bus and set up to become targets after federal leadership outlined their agenda in the truth filter. This was a tough position to be in, and even though they had some level of support, anytime you go in and you attempt to usurp a leadership body that has already established its influence, it's a complex and complicated process that has the potential to backfire. And in my opinion, I think that's exactly what happened. Under the circumstances and based on the high crimes that federal leadership was already accusing these guys of, treason, hijacking the state system, violating the NF Constitution, and having good solid C's hit for the sole purpose of furthering their corrupt agenda, Mateo and BJ should have been directed to bypass any attempts at forging diplomacy and to basically just take out their targets. I'm not going to get into it any more than that, but when you expose your hand and you put individuals on notice that have already proven themselves to be tyrants, then what do you expect to happen? They're going to get rid of you because you've now posed yourself as being a direct threat. Anyways, I'm saying all this to prove a bigger point at the conclusion of this story. And I'll come back to this later. But it's obvious that even NF leadership held both Mateo and BJ in high regard based on the fact that these were the two individuals that they reached out to. Bottom line, Corny, Pinky, Skip, and Tibbs placed a lot of hope and confidence in these two, hoping that they had the ability and influence to unify the state and federal systems back under one leadership. This in itself speaks volumes about the characters of both of these individuals. Anyways, I'm sure that anyone and everyone who had ever met Mateo would say that he was someone who was deeply committed to that lifestyle and that he also took his commitment to the NF serious. Anyone that says different is lying. But when the feds unsealed Operation Quiet Storm, this put Mateo in another tough position. And I would even go as far as saying that this was probably the most adversity that he had ever been faced with in his entire life. For those of you that know about Mateo's entire history, then you guys know that he's been put in situations before in the past that probably would have made other people check in. One involving his dad, Silver Fox, and then later another situation involving two of his sisters, Lisa and Sophie, who were said to have been greenlighted by NF leadership. I'm not going to get into all the details of what happened, but this was actually printed in the Monterey Herald newspaper, and it was something that was well known in Salinas. But Mateo stayed the course, and he did this despite the fact that his two sisters were being targeted by the same organization that he belonged to. To complicate this even more, this happened at a time when Paki was still with Lisa, and they also had kids together. But regardless of how solid Mateo had been up to that point, Operation Quiet Storm posed its own set of problems. For starters, he had just been targeted and stabbed by the state's self-appointed leadership, the same group of individuals that were also being indicted. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be those naysayers that are probably going to say, well, he should have just held his mud, he should have just fought his case, and then he should have just waited until they shipped him off to federal prison, where he probably would have been embraced and cleared. An assertion they probably wouldn't even have honored or followed themselves. I'm not advocating that cooperation under any circumstances is okay or justified in any situation. I've said that before and I'll continue to say it. Despite having made some of the choices that I made myself almost 20 years ago, I'm always going to say that it's bad business on any level and that dishonor is a hard pill to swallow. But every situation is different and every situation comes with its own set of circumstances. Regardless to how solid someone might have been throughout their entire prison or gang career, and despite how much they might have believed in that belief system, if all the worlds line up in the perfect alignment and there's several things that are pushing someone in that same direction, even the most dedicated down-ass gangster can fold under that type of pressure. What I really find comical is that there's people that will run content on Mateo and they'll refer to him as a rat, a snitch, a degenerate, or a piece of shit when it's obvious that they would have done the same thing or that they already have. Especially when it comes from people that have never operated on that level. Those kind of derogatory words just seem to come out so freely when they've never experienced that type of adversity themselves. It's a tough situation to be in. Self-preservation has a way of putting things in perspective. And some of these self-proclaimed gangsters can talk about how solid they are, how loyal they are, how they'd always keep it 10 toes down, and how they'd never go out ass backwards until they're blue in the face. But until they get put in that situation and it's their life that's hanging in the balance, they can't say shit about it and their opinions are irrelevant. Think about Mateo's situation and just a little bit of what he was faced with. After having been down for close to 30 years at that point, this power struggle between the state and federal factions plays out. He gets placed in the middle of it, and the end result is that he ended up becoming a target by the state faction. Regardless of whether or not you think you can salvage your career, when your own people turn on you and they physically stab you, it'll test your resolve no matter how much you believe in that shit. But even if he still wasn't swayed at that point, imagine being down for close to 30 years and then being propositioned by the feds who tell you that either one or two things is about to happen. One, that you're about to be indicted by the federal government and that this pretty much is going to guarantee that you're going to die in prison. Or two, you can compromise that entire belief system that you've been following for all these years and possibly get your freedom back. The thought of possibly getting back out after almost doing 30 years and enjoying what little bit of life that you have left would have been enough to pull it just about anybody. And it's almost an unfair proposition. In prison, I used to see people who would get so tired of existing in the shoe, being locked up back there, that eventually one day they would go out to medical, dental, the law library, or a personal visit, and they'd never come back. They'd go on one of those secret squirrel missions and they disappear because they wanted to go back out to a main line and enjoy some of the small luxuries and privileges that they would have on an SNY instead of continuing to be warehoused in the shoe. People get tired of living like that. So again, think about somebody that's been down for close to 30 years on a life sentence, and now they're told that there's a possibility that they could go home. After decades of hopelessness, it might actually be too much to digest. Like I said, I know that most of the self-proclaimed hardcore gangsters are going to probably say that they would have passed up that opportunity and that they would have kept it solid. But again, I call bullshit when I see it. We all have one shot at life. If you drop the ball and you squander those choices, there might not be no second chances. You might not be able to come back from that. These are the kind of realities that you think about when you're faced with this kind of dilemma. So despite what you think about Matt or how you feel about some of the choices he made for himself, it's hard to pass judgment on that man if you've never been in a situation like that yourself. I remember a few years ago when Operation Quiet Storm first broke, a lot of people were speculating about whether or not Mateo was cooperating. Nobody knew one way or the other for sure, yet a lot of people were putting videos out indicative that he was. I was the only one that was in contact with him at that time, and although I was pretty sure I knew what was going on, I never put nothing out there because it wasn't my place to speak on it. And it wasn't about views or being the first one to break that story. This was my boy. For a long time when we would talk, it was like the big white elephant in the room. Neither one of us said anything about it. We would just bullshit and talk about the past. But eventually, I broached that conversation. I did it because I knew he was in a tough spot. And when I did, I told him to just make sure that he thought about everything that was involved and that to just make sure that he could live with whatever choices that he made, regardless of what it was, that he could wake up every day and tell himself, you know what, I did the right thing. I also told him that he didn't have anything to prove to anyone and not to base his choices off of what other people might think. That for once, he needed to think about what was best for him and his family, and that's all that mattered. I didn't suggest anything either way because that's not my place to do that. And again, I don't go around promoting that or making anyone think that it's ever okay to do that. I just let him know that people were going to support him no matter what he did and that I fully understood that he was in a tough position. Because a lot of the time we get so caught up in that mindset of worrying about what other people think that those become mental stumbling blocks. But this is only when we apply that prison mentality or that other belief system to ourselves. Society out here in the free world, they don't think like that. They don't apply that belief system to themselves. So why should we? If you're truly trying to get away from all that, then why continue to apply that belief system to yourself? No, that's something I trip on. Some of these grown-ass men who claim to be mature and who claim to be on some positive shit still continue to try to push some of those same lines, despite being burnt up themselves and despite being in the same position as some of the people they talk about. Despite being burnt up themselves and despite being in the same position as a lot of the people that they talk about, they still seem to think that people give two shits about what yard they've been on, how many years they spent in the shoe, who they know, what they did, etc., etc. It's mind-blowing, and they've created this illusion in their mind that they're still standing on all this honor and all this integrity, based on the fact that they believe people don't know the real truth about the skeletons that they still have in their closets. Anyways, not long after we had that conversation, I basically heard about him agreeing to cooperate around the same time that everyone else did. But when I broached that conversation with Mateo, I tried to encourage him to do what was best for himself and his family, and it still wasn't an easy conversation. He didn't want to talk about it, and there's no doubt about the fact that he felt ashamed for even considering it. There's people that will adamantly say that if someone dishonors themselves and they cooperate by turning on their people, that this is indicative that they were never a true believer in the first place. I disagree wholeheartedly with that assertion, and here's why. People change their political views and the things that they place their loyalties in all the time. I could give you reason after reason why, and you could probably come up with some of your own reasons. But the fact that he tapped out and did what he did in order to get his freedom back doesn't mean that he was never a true believer. All it means is that he values his freedom more than the loyalties that he once placed in that lifestyle. Because most of the time when someone's disillusioned and blinded by the things that they've been brainwashed into believing, that light won't go on until they've been faced with that type of adversity themselves. And like I said, based on the fact that a lot of people are being critical based on his decision to become the star witness in Operation Quiet Storm, nobody can even begin to comprehend what he's up against unless they've walked in his shoes themselves. So by the time Mateo took the stand and decided to cooperate in Operation Quiet Storm, most of the defendants that were originally indicted in that case had already pled out or had jumped on deals that they couldn't pass up. The only remaining 4 that he testified against were David Cervantes, DC, James Perez, Conejo, Guillermo Solorio, Capone, and George Franco, Puppet. All of them were convicted of racketeering conspiracy and special findings for several murkings that they allegedly orchestrated. Antonio Guillen Truco was previously sentenced to 175 months in federal prison. DC and Conejo were sentenced to 120 months for their roles as some of the main instigators in this case. And then finally, Capone and Puppet were both sentenced to 175 months. So these guys have sentences that range anywhere from 13 to 14 years. The interesting thing is that they're going to go serve their Fed time, and then when they're done, they're going to get shipped back to the state where they have life sentences. The question then is what happens next. The political chess game is already in motion. The easiest thing and the most predictable thing that everybody's waiting for is for these guys to start landing in some of these federal USPs and then to start getting picked off one by one for their indiscretions. Some people would say that if Corny and Skip act on their personal feelings, then this is all but guaranteed to happen. There was some serious accusations and some real disrespectful things that were said about both Skip and Corny in the Truth Filter. So only time will tell. My guess is that given the opportunity, some of these guys are chopped liver when they land in the federal system. They might not hit all of them, but the main catalysts, the ones who they feel might have used their positions and influence to lead that main push, are probably the ones who might get dealt with. I could be wrong, but treason, hijacking the entire state system, manipulating the NF Constitution for personal gain, spilling the blood of good solid brothers who didn't have it coming, and finally, this whole idea of promoting the mariposa tattoo as a symbol of unification and allegiance with the Mexican mafia goes above and beyond crossing the line. These aren't forgivable offenses or things that could just be brushed off. These are considered to be high crimes, and then you got to think about what kind of message you not only send to the rest of the organization, but also to the entire movement. The NR members and the non-affiliated norteños that might have bore witness to some of the afflictions and the clear abuse that these individuals are responsible for inflicting. Another question that I'm sure is going to be answered over the course of time is what's going to happen to those individuals that might be given a pass. What I mean is, once they're reprimanded and censured for their roles, what type of expectations are they going to be held to once they're shipped back to the state system? Are they permanently banned for life from ever holding a position again, similar to what happened to Gerald Rubalcaba, Cuete, and Tex Hernandez? Or will they be placed in positions with the understanding that the state system now falls under the guise of leadership in the federal system? Needless to say, 13 or 14 years is a long time, and a lot can happen during that time. But I would expect that over the course of those 13 or 14 years, that Skip, Corny, Pinky, and Mad Dog will have already gained full control over the state system long before any of these guys are shipped back. Also, what happens to the agreement to end hostilities? There's a lot of open-ended questions that a lot of people are wondering about, but I guess only time will tell, and we'll see what happens once they get there. I'm not going to make predictions about everyone, but I tend to believe that DC might be given a pass and that both Chuco and Conejo are going to have issues. Puppet might even have issues himself since he knows better. I'm sure people are also wondering where these guys are going to get shipped off to, and if there's also a possibility that the federal BOP might try to keep these guys separated, especially because everyone knows about the power struggle and the impending political issues. What happens if Chuco and Conejo are shipped off to ADX and are never put in a USP where anybody ever has a chance to do their due diligence? Hypothetically, let's say that does happen and they're deemed to be targets. I personally believe that by the time they make it back to the state system, that they would have had lost all the influence and credibility that they once had, and that there would be welcoming committees waiting for them. They left as leaders and they had control over the whole state system. But after 13 or 14 years, I believe that their status would have been thoroughly decided and that there wouldn't be no question about it. I'm just throwing different scenarios out there and speculating based on what I know and some of my own personal experiences with these guys. But what do I know? I could be completely wrong and it could play out completely different. Only time will tell. Anyways, personally, I wish Mateo the best, and I hope he does get to enjoy what little bit of life that he does have left with his family. At 60, the clock's ticking and he ain't no spring chicken anymore. So during his sentencing, he read a letter that he wrote to the judge who presided over these cases, U.S. District Judge Yvonne Gonzalez Rogers, apparently reflecting back on his past gang life, stating that while he no longer wakes up each day looking to further the gang's cause, he still deals with the residual effects of his former lifestyle. Namely, the guilt, the shame, and the regret he feels for all the bad things that he's done to people throughout the entire time that he's operated under the capacity of an active gang member. He went on to say this verbatim: "I made some very bad choices with very bad results. I am truly sorry for all the pain and suffering I have inflicted on others, all the turmoil and harm that I caused, as well as the ripple effect that was created by my actions. This all stemmed from a mindset and a belief system that was wrong. I see now that I had a flawed rationalization of how I saw and viewed things." So in the end, the judge sentenced him to time for credit served, despite the fact that the district attorney asked that he be given 48 months in federal prison. So the judge ended up sentencing him to credit for time served, despite the fact that the district attorney still asked for him to be sentenced to 48 months in federal prison. But even though he was sentenced to credit for time served on this federal case, unfortunately, none of this has any bearing on the 26-year to life sentence that he's serving out of Monterey County for homicide and manslaughter convictions. These convictions will keep him in prison until the parole board feels that he's suitable for parole. So the last time he went in front of the parole board was in 2014. And because he was still active and didn't have a lot of mitigating circumstances at that time, he was given a 7-year denial. But to his favor, he's now eligible to go back to the parole board. And obviously, since the last time he went, a lot has changed. Based on the fact that he cooperated and based on the fact that California is finally starting to release a lot of lifers, I believe he'll be granted parole the next time he goes in front of the board. So I'll keep you guys updated on anything new I hear about his case. And like I said, I'll probably run a full profile on him sometime in the near future. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering loyalty, as well as those of you who continue to tap into this channel. Until the next one, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your evening. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.